So we're going to start in verse 10, and we did 10 and 11 last week, and then we'll go all the way through 16, I think. It says, Then Simon Peter drew a sword and slashed off the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's slave. But Jesus said to Peter, Put your sword back into its sheath. Shall I not drink from the cup of suffering the Father has given me? So we talked about last week that John is the only one who names the slave, right? Names the high priest slave, Malchus. And we can kind of infer, some people believe that was because he may have eventually became a believer, right? And John doesn't even tell us that Jesus healed his ear. You have to go to the other Gospels, right? And we talked about before, why does John leave out certain details and talk about certain things? Because he knew what Matthew, Mark, and Luke had written, right? And he's telling a different story from his perspective. And every person has a different perspective, right? And so he doesn't mention that the right ear was healed, but we know it was because they tell us in the other Gospels. But everything Jesus has been saying in John 13 through 17 has prepared us for a very different kind of victory than the world expects, and even at this point that Peter expects, right? Because Peter is still wanting to fight with the worldly weapon, right? He pulls out his sword, he cuts off an ear. He's still expecting Jesus to confront the world with power, with force, with political revolution, miraculous domination. But Jesus, in John's gospel, has been teaching the opposite all along, right? That the kingdom is going to advance through love. John 13, if we go back there, 13, 34 through 35, he says, So now I'm giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. Greatness is shown in humbleness, right? In servanthood. If you go back to the foot washing, right? What is Jesus teaching them? He's teaching them how to humble themselves. He's showing them that victory comes through obedience to the Father. When he's praying in John 17, what does he keep talking about? I'm doing your will, right? I'm gonna fulfill what you've given me to do. Chapter 15 taught us the disciples will overcome by what? By abiding, not by fighting, right? John 15 is the abiding chapter, right? Where he talks about abiding in the vine and abiding in him. And so then we get to John 17 where Jesus has prayed for unity. He's prayed for holiness. He's prayed for truth. He never one time prayed for military strength, right? He never one time prayed for, power. And so after his prayer, Jesus is not going to seize power. He's going to surrender himself, right? And so we talked about it. If you go back up, it says he steps forward. When they show up, when Judas shows up with all the army and all the blazing torches and all of the soldiers and all the stuff, what does Jesus do? He steps out and says, You're looking for me, right? Here I am. And then he tells Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Now, what's up with the cup, right? Like, what's this cup he's talking about? The cup is the Father's will. And so it comes to symbolize the suffering, the death, through which our salvation will be accomplished, right? The cup of suffering, the cup. But throughout Scripture, in the Old Testament, the cup symbolized God's wrath and his judgment against sin. Okay? So if we're going to read y'all some Old Testament. Psalm 75:8 says, For the Lord holds a cup in his hand that is full of foaming wine mixed with spices. He pours out the wine in judgment, and all the wicked must drink it to its dregs. So what's this cup? It's the Lord's judgment, right? So what is Jesus when he says, I got to take the cup? It's the judgment, right? It's the suffering. In Isaiah 51:17, Isaiah says, Wake up, O Jerusalem. You have drunk the cup of the Lord's fury. You have drunk the cup of terror, tipping out its last drops. In Jeremiah 25:15, Jeremiah says, This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, said to me. Take from my hand this cup filled to the brim with my anger, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink from it. So what is this cup? When Jesus starts talking about, shall I not drink from the cup? All of these Jews, right, are going to immediately think about the cup of judgment, the cup of wrath, right? The cup of what's coming from the Lord. So when Jesus speaks of the cup, he's not merely talking about his physical suffering, his betrayal, his crucifixion. He is, but the deeper reality is that he is about to bear the judgment that we deserve. Right? He's about to take on himself the judgment of God's anger and fury against sin, not against people, right? It's not against people, it's against sin. And he's about to take all of that upon himself. And I don't know if y'all have noticed this, but John doesn't talk about Jesus praying in the garden, right? He doesn't tell that story like they do in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where he's like, if there's any other way, not my will, but your will be done. We have to go to the other gospels to hear that. But this explains his agony in the other gospels, right? It's not just that he's going to die a brutal death. That's part of it. I'm sure as a human, right, as a man, he knows what crucifixion looks like. He understands what's about to happen. But he also understands that he's about to take on all the sin of the world, right? That he's about to take on all of the judgment of the Father. And then, so what does he pray? He says, Father, if you're willing, if there's any other way, remove this what? This cup from me. Take this from me, right? And so nevertheless, what does he say? Not my will, but yours be done. Listen, Jesus was not shrinking just from the nails or just from the beating. He was contemplating becoming the sin bearer for the whole world. That's a lot, right? That's a lot that he's about to take on. John Calvin says it this way: Christ's greatest suffering was not merely bodily pain, but enduring the judgment of God against sin in our place. He knew the Father couldn't look, right? He knew there was going to be, for a moment, this separation, right? Because he was going to take on all of the sin of the world. And so there's all of this agony that is going on. I love how The Chosen portrays this when he's in the garden praying. Look, he's stressing. He's sweating great drops of blood because he's stressed, right? Because he's like, if there's any other way, there's not. Okay, not my will, your will be done, right? So Peter, when they show up, sees an enemy, right? And what do you do to an enemy? You fight them, right? But Jesus, when they show up, sees a cup to drink. He says, "What shall I not?" Let me read it again. But Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Shall I not drink from the cup of suffering the Father has given me?" Who gave it to him? The Father. So we've talked about this as we moved along. This is not these men didn't make the decision, right? They think they're in charge. They're not in charge, right? God's in charge. Peter thinks the battle is against soldiers. Jesus knows the battle is against sin, death, and Satan, right? He's fighting a bigger battle than just this little group of men that's standing in front of him. Peter wants to save Jesus from the cross, and Jesus knows the cross is why he came, right? He can't bypass the cross. That's when you go through the temptation, right? And the devil is that was all Satan was trying to tempt Jesus to do, is I can get you all that power and all of that, and you don't have to go through the cross. You can bypass it. And Jesus is like, no. He quotes the word to him, right? He has to go through the cross. Jesus has repeatedly spoke of and prayed and submitted himself to the Father's purpose, and now the moment has arrived. It's easy to say we'll be obedient to the Lord, right? When we're not faced with the actual consequences of being obedient to the Lord, right? And so Jesus, it wasn't just words that he was saying. Now the time has come that the prayer is actually going to become action, right? The son who prayed, "Father, glorify your Son," is now willingly accepting the cup of suffering. That's what he calls it. The cup was given by who? The Father. But it was drunk willingly by the Son. And because Christ drank the cup of judgment, listen, we get a different cup, which is the cup of salvation, right? Psalm 116:13 says, "I will lift up the cup of salvation and praise the Lord's name for saving me." Listen, it is a cup of salvation. We get the cup of reconciliation. We get the cup of fellowship with God. Why? Because he took the cup that we deserved, right? And he drank it willingly. John 18:11 is therefore one of the clearest statements in the gospel that Jesus' death was not a tragic accident. It was the Father's plan, right? He says, who gave me the cup? My Father gave me the cup, right? His willing obedience, the means by which salvation would be accomplished. So Peter is still wanting to confront his enemies, right? Crush them, do all the things. Jesus, how is he going to confront the world? By bearing their hostility, right? By taking their judgment, by taking the wrath of God, right? So the soldiers, this is verse 12, so we're going to keep going. It says, so the soldiers, their commanding officer, and the temple guards. I mean, how many men does it take to take a man who's saying, "Here I am, take me," right? But it says they're all involved in arresting Jesus. They tied him up. And then first they took him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at that time. Now, this is where I told you I'm going to give you all a little history lesson. This is not necessarily directly from the Bible, but this is from history and what we know. It says, verse 14, Caiaphas was the one who had told the other Jewish leaders, it is better that one man should die for the people. So if you'll remember, this was quoted earlier in John. So they come and they arrest and they bound the one who's coming willingly, right? He's not fighting them. He's not resisting them. Just moments earlier, these are the same men who, what happened to them when he said, I am? They fell back, right? Because of the power of the statement of him saying, I am. They literally fall back. Now, they're the ones that are arresting Jesus, tying him up. Listen, Christ was not overpowered. He was obedient, right? And so this is just clear from the story. And it says, first they took him to Annas. Now, Annas was not the current high priest. He was the former high priest. Even John tells us this, right? He says, first they took him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at that time. So Caiaphas was the high priest. Annas was his father-in-law. Why did they take him there, right? It seems like you would take him to the current high priest, right? History teaches us that Annas was still the most influential religious power in Jerusalem. He had been appointed high priest around AD 6 by the Roman governor Quirinius, and then he was in power until AD 15. So about 11 years he was in power, but then Rome removed him from office, probably because he had so much influence over the people. Okay, so Rome didn't like him, so they took him out of position and they put his son-in-law Caiaphas in position. But to the Israelites, to the Jewish people, Annas was still the one in control. Okay, he still had the power. And so I assume Caiaphas was like a puppet, right? And Annas was in the background working his thing out. I think The Chosen kind of portrays all this too. But although his son-in-law Caiaphas officially held the office, Annas remained the power behind the scenes. History gives us a fascinating picture of these two. Together, they formed perhaps the most powerful religious family in first century Jerusalem. They were the center of the religious order within Jerusalem at that time. Jewish people viewed the priesthood as a lifelong office. So they had come, they're being controlled by Rome at this point, right? Which is why everybody wants Jesus to come and overthrow Rome. And so Rome had made the decision to take Annas out of this position, but to the Jews, he was still in control, okay? And so he's kind of working things behind the scene. He belonged to a wealthy, influential, priestly family. So he came from what tribe? Right? He came from the tribe of the priesthood, right? The Levites. You didn't become a priest unless you were from that tribe, right? So he was from the tribe of the Levites. And then 5 of his sons become high priests at some point, but right now his son-in-law is high priest, okay? This family controlled much of the temple establishment. Luke said in his gospel, Annas and Caiaphas were the high priest. You couldn't have 2 high priests, but you did. Why? Because Caiaphas was kind of a figurehead and Annas was ruling things behind. So who did they take him to first? They take him to Annas, okay? Technically, there could only be 1 high priest, but he was still viewed as the patriarch and the power over the temple, over things that went on in Jerusalem. Now, Caiaphas served as high priest for almost 20 years under Rome. Now, not under Rome, it was considered lifelong, right? But under Rome would frequently put people in that position, and when they didn't like what they did, they would remove them from that position. But Caiaphas stayed in there for almost 20 years, which was rare under Rome. Why? This suggests that he was politically skilled and maintained a good relationship with Rome, right? His primary concern appears to have been preserving stability. That's why he says, don't you realize it's better for you that this one man should die than we should all die, right? He is more concerned about keeping the status quo, keeping things the way they are. Why? Because he had a good relationship with Rome, right? They let him do what he wanted to do, and then they didn't bother him, and so he doesn't want Jesus coming in and messing all this up, right? The priestly leaders feared that a messianic movement around Jesus would cause Rome to intervene, listen, and threaten their way of life. And their way of life was pretty good, right? They had money, they had prestige, they had power, they were making decisions, right? They weren't too concerned about the fact that they were submitted to Rome at that time. Annas and Caiaphas were associated with the priestly order connected to the Sadducees. So when you're reading through the New Testament, you often hear about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees and the Sadducees did not get along. They did not agree on things, right? There were things that they disagreed on, and the Sadducees were, I guess, considered more wealthy, more higher, right? And so this family is connected with the Sadducees. They controlled, listen, the temple administration, the temple finances, the sacrifices, the relationships with the Roman authorities. So when Jesus comes in and flips over the tables and drives out the money changers and does all of his stuff back earlier in the gospel, who is he directly affecting? This family, right? Because that's where their money came from. And so they would have been highly upset at Jesus for what he did, right? And so that began their anger toward him, the hostility that they have toward Jesus. I brought up the thing that I'm watching about Secrets of the Bible. In 1990, archaeologists discovered an ornate burial box bearing the name Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Many believe this was the Caiaphas in John's gospel. So they said it was very expensive, it was very ornate, so they had money, right? John's readers would have recognized immediately that Jesus was being brought before the most powerful religious dynasty in Israel. They mention his name. John mentions his name. Why? Because he was powerful. This scene is not merely Jesus versus a priest. It is Jesus versus the entire religious establishment of that day, right? So he's not only going to have to face Rome, he's going to have to face the religious establishment of the Jews at that time. And yet John's irony remains. Annas has influence, but Jesus has authority, right? Caiaphas holds the office, but Jesus is the true high priest. They believe they're judging Jesus, but one day Jesus is going to judge them, right? This is why John takes the unusual step of mentioning Caiaphas, his earlier statement. The men who thought that they were protecting Israel were unknowingly fulfilling God's plan to save Israel, right? They don't understand the part that they're playing in this story, right? Jesus has just finished his high priestly prayer. If you'll remember, I told you, John 17 is often called the high priestly prayer of Jesus, right? Now he is brought before the official high priest of Israel. There's more irony here, right? The true mediator stands before earthly mediators. The one who truly represents God is questioned by those, they just have human titles, right? And the perfect high priest is condemned by imperfect priest. So now what does it mean that Jesus is our high priest? Because we're not Jewish, right? And we don't have a high priest. And we don't really understand what that meant at that time and what that position played. So if you go to the book of Hebrews, which most people believe Paul wrote, he gives us detailed details on what it means that Jesus is our high priest. So we're going to read some of that today. Hebrews 4:14 through 16. It says, "So then, since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced all of the same testings we do, yet he did not sin. So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it most." He's telling us about the high priest that we have, right? Compared to the high priest that they have, not comparable, right? And so Annas and Caiaphas entered an earthly temple. Jesus, he says, entered heaven, right? He says, we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, right? They offered animal sacrifices. Listen, Jesus offered himself, the blood, right? Their ministry was temporary. His priesthood is eternal. Then he goes on to say, we have a priest who understands us. Listen, they were far removed from the people, right? They didn't interact with the daily people, lowly people, right? They considered themselves better. Paul's like, look, you have a high priest who understands you. He knows temptation. He knows suffering. He knows rejection. He knows grief. He knows pain. Now he makes sure to say, not because he sinned, right? But because he fully entered into humanity without sin, right? So that he could become a high priest who stands in our place. And then He gives us the best news ever. He says, now you can come boldly to the throne of grace. Listen, the high priests of Israel were distant and inaccessible. The common person couldn't just go to them. He's like, look, you can come, and you can come boldly to the throne of grace because of what our high priest has done, right? We're going to keep reading Hebrews. This is Hebrews 7:23 through 28. It says, there were many priests under the old system, for death prevented them from remaining in office. But because Jesus lives forever, his priesthood lasts forever. Therefore, he is able once and forever to save those who come to God through him. He lives forever to intercede with God on their behalf. If you need to underline a verse in your Bible, underline that one, right? Because Jesus' prayer in John 17, he didn't stop praying in John 17. He's still praying. It says he's still interceding with God on our behalf. He is the kind of high priest we need because he is holy and blameless, unstained by sin. He has been set apart from sinners and has been given the highest place of honor in heaven. Verse 27, unlike those other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices every day. They did this for their own sins first and then for the sins of the people. But Jesus did this once for all when he offered himself as the sacrifice for the people's sin. The law appointed high priests who were limited by human weakness, but after the law was given, God appointed his son with an oath, and his son has been made the perfect high priest forever. And so look, Paul, whoever wrote Hebrews, it's like, listen, I need you to understand. Y'all know what a high priest here is like. Let me tell you what our real high priest is like, right? Let me tell you what Jesus came and what he accomplished. And I've already said this. Verse 25, the one who prayed for his disciples and us in John 17, he says is still making intercession for us today. If you don't feel like anybody's praying for you, Jesus is. Just take it to him, right? Hebrews 10. Hebrews is a great book. Hebrews 10, somebody wanted me to do Hebrews. I can't remember who it was. Hebrews 10, 11 through 12 says, under the old covenant, the priest stands and ministers before the altar day after day, offering the same sacrifices again and again. Listen, which will never take away sins. So they did this ritual. They did this animal sacrifice, which thank God I'm not alive during that time, right? They did this animal sacrifice. Imagine the stench and the smell and all the stuff, right? Day after day after day. And it never removed their sins, right? It never made them holy before God. It got them through. They would do it until the next offering or the next sacrifice, right? Keep going. Verse 12. But our high priest offered himself to God as a single sacrifice for sins, good for all time. Then he sat down in the place of honor at God's right hand. Listen, the priests that lived back then, their work was never finished. They had to keep going back and keep going back and keep going back. Jesus got to sit down. Why? Because he said, my work is done. My work is complete. I can sit down, right? When Jesus stands before the high priest, the true high priest stands before the temporary priest. So look, Jesus is standing before Annas and Caiaphas, and he's like, he knew, right? He knew what he was going to accomplish. The perfect sacrifice stands before those. Listen, all they could do was supervise the sacrifice. They didn't have any control over whether God accepted it, right? Or what it was going to accomplish. Jesus becomes our mediator between God and man. And he is being questioned by men who claim to mediate for God. That was their big claim to Israel, right? Is we're the mediator. We're the mediator between you and God. Jesus is coming and he's saying, I'm going to be the ultimate final mediator, right? Between God and man. And so what appears to be humiliation is actually the beginning of his priestly offering. The sacrifices is started, right? He's willingly submitting himself. He is both the priest. So the thing about Jesus is he's both the priest and the offering, right? So he's going to be our high priest, but he's also the lamb that was slain before the foundation of the world, right? These are things our mind really can't wrap around, right? Mm-hmm. But he is. He's both. He's both the priest and both the offering. John 17 is his high priestly prayer, and John 18 through 19 is the great high priest proceeding to the altar. The cross becomes both the place of sacrifice and the means by which he opens access to God forever. Annas and Caiaphas could only bring people near to an earthly temple. Jesus, our great high priest, brings us all the way into the presence of God. They really couldn't get you to God, right? Jesus is going to get us all the way in. He says, the veil's been torn, right? That you have come boldly to the throne of grace, right? Where you have access. Normal people back then didn't have access. Y'all read the Old Testament, right? Like there were certain rituals and rules and regulations on who went into the presence and who was able to go. And these priests had to wear bells around their feet because if they presented a sacrifice that God didn't accept, they would die. And the only way you knew they were dead was the bell stopped ringing, right? So then you pull them out by a rope that they had attached to them. Listen, we can go to God. Right? Jesus came and made a way. So Jesus is brought before the high priest, but the religious establishment, listen, they had already decided he was going to die. Right? This is just, they're just they have to go through the legalities, right? And they really, if you watch The Chosen and you study it, they really didn't, they went around the legalities, right? They weren't supposed to be doing what they were doing, but yet they did it anyway, right? This was not a search for truth. They're not asking Jesus these questions because they really want to understand him, right? They're not searching for truth. It was a search for a legal path to execution. They're just trying to figure out how can we get this man executed. Caiaphas' prophecy comes back into view. Caiaphas meant one man should die instead of the nation, but God knew one man will die for the nation and for all mankind, right? They think they're devising a plan. It's not really their plan, right? It's God's plan. And so the path to glory is going to run through the cross. There's no way around it. We can't avoid the cross. And this is the beginning of the victory. Now we're going to get to Simon Peter. I'm only going to read 15 and 16, and then we'll talk more. We'll talk a little bit about Peter today, and then we'll talk more about it next week. But it says, Simon Peter followed Jesus. I love John. As did another of the disciples, which most people believe was John. Okay. He never refers to himself. He always calls him that, the other disciple. That other disciple, now this is interesting, that other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. So John actually goes into the courtyard of Annas' house where Jesus is being brought to be questioned. Now it says Peter had to stay outside the gate. But then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching at the gate, and she let Peter in. Okay, so I have lots of questions here, right? I need to sit down with John one day. But the identity of the other disciple has often been understood to be John himself. Now, there are other views out there. Some people think it may have been Nicodemus. That would explain how he knew the high priest, right? Had Nicodemus become a disciple? So questions, right? There are other views. You can find other views. But the majority of the people think this was John, okay? Now, what do we know about John? He was young. He was the youngest disciple, probably a teenager at this time, right? The question is, how did John, this little teenager born to a fisherman, gain access to the high priest's household, right? How was he able to follow and Peter has to stay outside? Well, there's a couple of different views on that too. One is because of his family's business. So what did his dad do? He was a fisherman, right? Zebedee. If you watch Chosen, you'll meet Zebedee. You can infer from the Gospels that Zebedee may have been a wealthy fisherman because he had servants, okay? And so if he was a wealthy fisherman who was running a thriving fishing business with his two sons, he may have delivered fish to the high priest household, right? And so John would have known people associated with the high priest. The word that they use there, it's not that he was friends with the high priest. It says he was acquainted. He knew of people within the household, right? And so probably it's related to the fishing business, okay? What we'll also learn, I think what you'll also see about John is John wasn't as loud as Peter, right? He probably wasn't drawing as much attention as Peter was. The Greek word used is acquainted. It doesn't say friendship. It doesn't mean agreement. Of course, listen, we know ultimately why was John able to go in? Because God allowed it, right? God causes all things to work together for good. And so there had to be an eyewitness, right? There had to be somebody who could tell us what happens when Jesus is brought before Annas, right? And so divine providence allows John all the way in, right, to witness what is going on. the proceedings. He witnesses the proceedings, and he later records the details that nobody else would have known at that point, right? Because nobody else was there. So Peter and John, listen, have you ever seen these people that do these funny memes about Peter and John? Like, comedians will do it a lot, and they'll be like, you know, don't tell anybody this story about me. And John will be like, it was Peter. Like, John, it was Peter. And so John is going to point out these subtle differences, right, between Peter and John. He begins to contrast the two disciples. So what happens first is John follows Jesus into the courtyard. And John doesn't tell us this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. They tell us that Peter followed at a distance. So what was he doing? He was kind of hiding in the background. So he's following, but he's not wanting to be seen. Probably because he just cut a dude's ear off. Okay? Right? And so he's probably like, I don't really want to get arrested right now. So he's hanging back, right? He's following at a distance. Peter's physical distance, though, I want you to get this, is starting to reflect a growing spiritual distance, right? He's beginning to distance himself from Jesus, right? Peter loves Jesus. Listen, he loves Jesus. He just cut a dude's ear off again, right? His problem was not a lack of devotion. Listen, it is a mixture of fear, confusion, right? That's why we say things like, don't make decisions, right? When you're in the middle of crazy situations, right? When you're afraid, don't make life-altering decisions, right? When you're at your worst. The moment of testing, Jesus has already told him, you're going to do what? You're going to deny me 3 times, right? Before the rooster crows. And now that time of testing has come, and he's following Jesus, but not too closely, right? I don't want to risk getting arrested. I don't want to risk people seeing me. Listen, the thing about sin, the thing about failure to believers, it doesn't happen all at once, right? We don't just wake up and be like, oh, I'm going to do this, right? There's this growing distancing that happens, right, between us and the Lord. And then we start making decisions that we would have never made, right? And then it leads us more and more into these decisions. Listen, they are often preceded by small steps away from close fellowship with Christ, right? So he's been close with Christ, but now he's beginning to distance himself a little bit. By contrast, listen, what's John doing? John's like, I'm going to be right where he is. I'm going to go into the house with him, right? And the thing about it is, he's not as bold as Peter. He's not out here making declarations that I'll die for you, Jesus. We never hear that. We never hear him declaring boldly out loud, I will die for you, Jesus. He doesn't yield a sword. He doesn't cut anybody's ear off. What he does when the crisis comes, he stays close, right? Now we know he's the one at the cross, right? When everybody else is left except the women, right? Who is with them? John is with them, right? And so, listen, this fits John's character throughout the gospel. He rarely draws attention to himself. Instead, he is content simply to remain near Jesus. Later, he will be at the foot of the cross when all the others have fled. Now, listen, I don't want this, and this was in the book that I read. This contrast is not ultimately meant to exalt John and condemn Peter. That's not what we're doing. Because in a few weeks, the disciple who's following at a distance in John 18 is going to become the disciple who boldly proclaims Christ before the authorities in Acts, right? Peter's boldness serves a purpose, right? And God is going to, he's just got to get it to where he's in control of it, right? But Peter's failure is real, but Peter's failure is not final, right? This is not, thank God, it's not the end of Peter's story, right? And so I love that John and the other disciples give us this view into Peter, right? It gives us this view into his story. One writer says it this way: John shows us the blessing of staying close to Christ. Peter shows us the grace Christ extends to those who fail. I've said it before, about testimonies. I think one of the greatest testimonies is God kept me, right? It's not I went out here and did all this stuff and I tried everything and the world didn't satisfy, right? And then I no, it's that Christ kept me. That other testimony is good too, right? They both serve their purpose. And so John is a picture of a disciple who, no matter what, is going to stay close to Christ. He wants his head on his chest, right? He wants to be where he is. He's not going to be deterred from leaving. Peter got some struggles, right? There's some things that God's still got to work. And again, Peter's older, right? He's older than John. John is young. Peter is older. He's been through some stuff, right? So listen, Peter shows us the grace that Christ extends to those that fail. This is not just about two disciples. It's actually about a faithful Savior who preserves both, right? Christ keeps them both. He keeps John, he keeps Peter, right? He actually said when he was praying in John 17 that I'm not going to lose any of them that you gave me. So what's he saying? I'm not going to lose Peter. It's going to look rough for a little bit, right? Peter's going to make some bad decisions. Peter's denial would be painful, but it would not be permanent. And then another detail that I think we often overlook, if you're just reading through this quickly, who does it say came and got Peter? John did, right? It says Peter had to stay outside the gate. This is verse 16. Then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching at the gate, and she let Peter in. What did John do? He went and got him. He knew he was out there, right? And he's like, I'm going to go get them to let him in. Listen, the other disciple spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door, and she brought Peter in. Even as Peter is heading toward failure, John helps him stay as close to Jesus as possible. He's like, come, get him, let him in. There's something deeply encouraging in that picture. Listen, as believers, we need faithful friends who will draw us back to Christ when fear, weakness, and failure are trying to keep us outside the gate. If there's people that there's that distance starting and they're starting to stand outside the gate, reach out, right? Pull them back. John's like, I got to go get Peter, right? Peter's standing outside the gate. Peter's story reminds us that temporary failure, listen, it's not final. It's not Peter's story. I think John knew it. Jesus definitely knew it, right? This is not the end of his story. So we haven't got to the denial yet. That's in the next few verses. Because he gets brought into the courtyard, and apparently there's a fire going on with the servants, and that's where he ends up. So we'll go over that next week.